What's up? My name is James Blissett. I'm a professional gambler and I am founder of Lucrative MMA, which is my MMA betting syndicate where I help people make money through betting on MMA. If you want all of my official picks and predictions, you can sign up via the link in my bio. The amount of money we charge for joining the syndicate is extremely small compared to the amount of money you will earn if you stay in the service long term. Today we're going to do a video about a specific mistake that I want to help you avoid when you're betting on MMA, and we're going to tell you a specific way you can not only avoid this mistake but also capitalize on this mistake to ultimately earn you more money in your pocket when you're betting on these MMA cards. Now that mistake is simple: not betting on fighters when they're making their UFC debut. This is specific to the UFC and this is specific to the fighters making their debut. So fighters are making their debut almost every single card these days, and every single champion in the organization has to make their debut at some point. Contrary to popular belief, a lot of these fighters that have went on to become massive stars in the UFC and even champions, they didn't come into the organization and completely dominate. I've got a list of fighters here and 5 of them have become champion in the UFC, and all of them have become big names in the UFC and potential stars. But they all have one thing in common: they lost their UFC debuts. So I'm gonna rattle these names off now, and I think you're probably gonna be surprised. Ben Rothwell, Carlos Condit, Brock Lesnar, Rafael Dos Anjos, Fabricio Verdum, Chael Sonnen, Matt Serra, and Wanderlei Silva. It doesn't matter the level of fighter, they are always prone to losing their UFC debut. So that's why you have to be extremely careful when you are betting on fighters who are making their debuts, no matter how good they are. There's 2 reasons I hypothesize that fighters making their UFC debuts often lose. So the first reason fighters lose their UFC debut, even though they may be better than the guy they fought, is UFC/octagon jitters. And what that basically means is a fighter comes in, but because it's their first fight, they have jitters, aka they have nerves. They're feeling nervous about the fight. And there's no surprise why they're feeling nervous of the fight. This is the biggest fight of their career. There is no bigger organization than the UFC. So if you're making your UFC debut, it is a massive moment in your life, because the UFC is the pinnacle of the organizations in the MMA world. And these fighters know, if I win my UFC debut and I go on to win multiple fights in the UFC, not only could I become champion, but I can secure an income for myself and my family for my future. That's a massive, massive weight on anybody's back. I don't care how hard you are. I don't care how tough mentally you are. It's still a massive weight for anybody. Oftentimes, this turns out to be too much pressure for these fighters. They cannot handle the pressure and they don't perform to the best of their ability. If we look at recent times, this has happened today. And I'm not saying these guys are going to become UFC champions. I'm actually saying they won't, because I don't think they will. But it's important to look at these recent examples because I really think both fighters underperformed to what they actually are. The first fighter I want to talk about is Max Rohskopf. Now, coming into the UFC, he had a lot of hype around him. I remember a lot of people who gamble on MMA. I remember a lot of people in the UFC/MMA scene, the analysts, they were hyping up Max coming in to make his debut, right? They were saying this guy is 6-0 on the regional scene. He's been dominating his opponents. He's the next thing. He's the future. And even Max was saying it himself. When he got into the UFC, he fought Austin Hubbard on his debut. It was on short notice, but he actually came in as the favorite for that fight. He ended up getting beat down pretty badly and he quit on the end of his stall at the end of round 2, I believe. He said, "I don't want to fight no more, no mass, I'm done." And the referee called off the fight. Everybody thought Max was going to dominate that fight. Now, we'll never know the reason why that happened. Maybe it was because Austin Hubbard is just a level above. Maybe Max didn't have a full training camp and that really affected him. Maybe it was the first reason I gave you, the UFC/octagon jitters. Another example, and an example that I think hits home the point I made about UFC octagon jitters even more, is the example of Daniel Zellhuber. He was coming in off Dana White's Contender Series and making his debut against Trey Ogden, and he was a -300 favorite. In that fight, I think you could clearly see that he had UFC/octagon jitters. He was nervous to throw, he didn't fight how he usually fights, and he hardly threw out any volume. Now again, we will never know the mindset behind him going into that fight, but it seemed pretty clear to me for the very first time he was on a big stage and he was nervous and he performed poorly because of that nervousness. A lot of fighters go through different mental and emotional phases before the fight, and the UFC Octagon jitters is definitely one, and it's something that may have had an impact on Max Roshkop's performance. So remember that the first reason why people do not perform to the best of their ability when they're making their UFC debuts is because they get nervous, they get Octagon jitters. These are things that these fighters feel, and it can dramatically impact their performance, which, if you bet on them, will impact your bankroll. And the second reason why fighters do not perform to the best of their ability when they are making their UFC debuts is because the level of competition they face in the UFC is much higher than the level of competition they have been facing outside of the UFC. We see it all the time. These fighters are massively juiced favorites, -300, -400, because they were champions in other organizations. But being a champion in another organization does not equate to being a champion in the UFC. And it doesn't even equate to winning fights in the UFC. We have seen multiple times, time and time again, that fighters who become champions in other organizations can't even win a fight in the UFC. This is a massively underrated thing. The level of competition gap between the UFC and the other organizations, even a number 2 organization, is massive. It's huge. A good example of this was a couple of weeks ago. A fighter called Hussein Ashkabov came in and made his UFC debut against a veteran in Jamal Emmers. Now, Jamal Emmers is not the highest level UFC fighter. He's definitely above average, but he's definitely below the best. So he's a good mid-range UFC fighter. Very good fighter. He was fighting Hussein Ashkabov, who was hyped up to be one of the biggest prospects coming into the UFC, making their debut for a very long time. He was 23-0. He was the favorite, and what happened? He got dominated by the mid-level UFC fighter, Jamal Emmers, which once again proves my point. Level of competition outside of the UFC cannot hold a candle to the level of competition in the UFC. So what that means is when fighters are making their UFC debut, they're taking a massive step up in competition. And this is the thing that you have to realize. So these are 2 things that you have to massively understand when fighters are coming in to make their UFC debut. If you don't understand them, you're going to lose a lot of money. Do not get caught up in the hype. Slow your whole process down. There will be more opportunities in the future to bet on these fighters. But good practice when a fighter is coming into the UFC and making their debut is to either pass on their fight or to fade them, to bet against them. So next time a fighter is coming in to make their UFC debut, think about the video you have watched today. Think about fighters' emotional states going into these fights. Think about them having UFC Octagon jitters, nerves. Think about them taking up a massive step up in competition. There is a time and place to bet on fighters, and there is a time and place to fade fighters. And it completely depends on the specific matchup and all the intangibles around that matchup. Good luck on your betting in the future, and I'll see you in the next video.